Doctors, what were the most haunting last words from a patient? Viewer edition.
Hey folks, Mr. Facts here, just letting you know that a lot of these stories are going to involve the tragic loss of family members, friends, stuff to do with death, and so just be prepared. Most of these stories are not terribly graphic. We will have a content warning for one story in particular, but yeah, some of these topics will be a little bit more dour, a little bit heavier, so just go in prepared if you do watch it at all. Story 1. My Nana passed away in June. She was hallucinating with terminal stage 3 kidney cancer that had spread to her bones. Her last words to me were 2 weeks prior to her death. I love you, a bushel and a peck and a hug around the neck. My Nana had been able to talk when she shouldn't have been able to. My Papa had died 9 months prior, and Mom talked about how she talked to Papa and even her mom. That's how we knew she was going out. She died a few days after this event. Last year, one of my aunts passed away. She had a rough life, but the year before she was extremely happy. Actually traveled a lot with her sisters and my baby cuz. She became even more close with 2 of my aunties and my mom. They would talk for hours, and she's been very happy to finally be able to have everything in her life going well. We didn't see my aunts a lot. We lived in different states. I've been connecting with my baby cuz via social media. One day, we got a call that my aunt fell in the shower and broke her hip. She was in the hospital. The next day, her results for COVID came in. She went downhill fast. Had terrible pneumonia and had to be in the ICU. She was put on ventilation for a week. The doctors and nurses said she wouldn't make it. By the end of the month, she was better, up, cracking her usual dirty jokes. My 2 aunts had been going back and forth from California to Arizona to help my baby cuz she's now a PA. They go home, then get a call that she needs more tests. She developed a severe fever, and her nurses didn't notice as she was on a regular ward. My aunt drove back. When my mom called me, I told her, call your sister to talk with her because I had a bad feeling. She hadn't been calling her like usual, fearing she'd disrupt her rest. I then got a sudden urge to drive to Arizona, the kind where I was pacing, wringing my hands, having panic attacks. I decided to go early the next morning from Nevada to Arizona. When I got there, my mom and aunts were there as well, all of my sick aunt's children. They kept telling her not to go. They figured out she had rampant sepsis. Then they said her kidneys had failed. By that night, she had full organ failure. Everyone kept telling her to hold on. When I got there, my comatose and extremely quiet aunt made a noise, and I swear to God, her hands squeezed mine. I told her, I'm here now, Auntie, as this happened. My other more sensitive and positive aunt was like, see, she's getting better. She hasn't made a sound in days. It had taken a week of testing to figure things out. By this time, she'd been transferred to a hospice care facility. My aunts and everyone left the room to give me a moment. I grabbed my aunt's hand and said to her, Auntie, you don't have to hang on anymore. All your children are here. They'll be staying the night in the room with you. It's okay to let go when my baby cuz falls asleep. My cuz had been extremely devastated, like crying like I remembered her as a child. She wasn't even sleeping. We worried about her. She was completely yellow by the time this happened. Before that, the doctors had told my cousins that it is a slow, drawn-out process, slow organ failure, that she could take months to pass or even years. My cuz was really believing she wasn't actively fading before our eyes. My cousins all stay, and my baby cuz finally falls asleep. My aunt took a huge breath and passed. By this time, the nurses let us all in the room. When she started to take that last breath, I turned to my aunt and said, she's ready. By the time my more sensitive baby cousins were awake, she was gone. I knew before the nurse was monitoring her. I turned and told the nurse, she's gone now. She checked 3 times and confirmed it. It felt like pain being lifted. I later came and thanked that nurse for letting us all squeeze into that room and for the excellent care and compassion she showed my family, most especially my cousins. My mom later thanked me for ordering her to call my aunt. Shortly after that call was when she slipped into a coma. My cousin found out she was expecting that week. She'd been trying for years and thought she couldn't become pregnant. We think my auntie gave her a miracle baby before she left because she knew she'd have a broken soul without her miracle. She's bittersweet about it. I'm glad I was there for my cousins and aunties. They'd not seen any of us cousins since childhood. Listen to your gut. It's tough to have to let go of a family member when you want to have hope. But it can also be important, both for you and for them, because I do truly believe people can hang on. You hear these stories all the time where people will be dying, but they will somehow just hang on until they can, talk to a certain person or do one certain little thing. And I think, the best that you can do in that time when they get that thing is to let them know that it's okay. Hey folks, this is a content warning. This story is going to contain a pretty graphic description of some physical mutilation. It's a little bit hard. It was a little hard to read, and it might be a little rough for some of you to hear. So if you're not interested in this story and you want to scroll up to story 2, just go to the time code that hopefully the editor has on screen now.
Story 2. I'm no doctor, but this has haunted me for decades. Around 1981, I was in the AF on a temporary duty to a remote site in some hellhole called Caliente, Nevada, 385 miles from my permanent duty base, Norton AFB. I rode a motorcycle at the time and rode that up there with the convoy of military vehicles. After a few weeks of installing some equipment on a mountaintop, I was more than ready to get out of there. That day the wind was viscous, gusting at 50 miles per hour or more. As I was about to pull out, a group of bikers, the Nomads out of Las Vegas, rode through town in the same direction I was going. I decided to give it a bit of time so as not to mingle up with them. I did not fit in with that crowd. The wind on the trip was a crosswind so bad that I would have to lean my motorcycle over just to go in a straight line, only to have it slow suddenly and have to get off the lean. It was a brutal ride. About an hour later, in the middle of nowhere, I topped a hill to find the Nomads had come to grief. One of their members had lost control, wiped out, and skidded off into the desert. I stopped to help. What greeted me was a horror I still dream about after 40 years. The biker guy was mangled but alive. His girlfriend was in much worse shape. She had come off the back of the bike, skidded across the road, and hit a metal reflector post back first just above her hips. She was basically torn in two. I ran down to help. The bikers were unglued with the situation. That post had cut her almost in half. The only thing holding her together was the skin and muscle tissue of her abdomen. Her intestines were spread out in the sand and brush. But that wasn't the worst of it. She had come to rest next to a black ant nest. These things were huge. They were all over her. She was still alive at that time, crying, whimpering, and dying before my eyes. Saddest thing was that none of the bikers were helping her. I ran back, grabbed a large canteen of water, and tried to wash the ants off her face. I held her head, brushed her hair when I could, and told her that I was there for her, she was loved, and I wouldn't leave her. I heard a siren coming, footsteps running down, and an NHP officer stood there looking at this and said, "Oh, F." Her last words were, "They're biting me, please make them stop." And she died in my arms. And now, after this long reply, I'll go to bed and relive this event. I've tried to erase it from my mind for 4 decades, but it will be back soon in my nightmares. Story 3. I'm not a nurse or doctor, but when my Nana was on her deathbed after having a stroke she couldn't recover from, she looked at my mom and her siblings one by one, oldest to youngest, and smiled. She looked at my cousins and whispered things I couldn't hear. When she got to me, my older brother was looking a little shaken and was hugging our mom. She told me to lean down, so I did. I'll never forget what she said. "I love you, kid. Take care of your brothers. I wish I could have spent more time with you." They weren't her last words, but it left me crying inside. Later, it turns out she told my older brother, "You're a strong boy and I'll know you'll take good care of your siblings." Her actual last words were to my younger brother, who at the time was 5. He said that she looked up at him, smiled, and said, "I'm proud of you. Maybe in another life we got to know each other more." 3 years later, my younger brother came up to me at school and said, "Where's Nana? She's been on vacation for a long time." It was heartbreaking to see his face when he realized those were her dying words, not just saying, "Goodbye for now, I'll see you soon." I've had to deal with so many kids that bullied him after that moment. It's awful to see people being insensitive about things they just don't understand. Even now, sometimes I hear him saying, "I miss you, Nana," and "You finally came back from your trip," only to wake up and realize it was all just a dream.
That is a thing that It's so tough for a young child who's old enough to remember someone, but not quite old enough to grasp death. I mean, I have no kids, no plans to ever have kids, so it's nothing that I think I'll ever have to go through. But parents who have to deal with trying to tell a child about this and guide them through it, you have all of my sympathy, because that cannot be hard for you or them.
Story 4. Story 10 from the original video actually made me tear up. It reminded me of my grandma. She died of Alzheimer's in June of last year. I was at the park with my family the last time I saw her. She hardly remembered us, and she was always very sad, saying stuff about her mother and how she missed her. When my dad had to take her to the residence, I couldn't kiss her goodbye because my face was dirty with chocolate and I didn't want to make her face dirty. What I didn't know was that it was the last time I'd see her. She suddenly stopped eating at the residence, and the caretakers told my father this. They got her to the hospital because she fell off the bed, I think. She wasn't going to live much longer. My father told my sister and I this the Friday evening before she passed away. My grandma was taken to the residence again on Saturday. She died while sleeping on her bed on the 6th of June at approximately 4 a.m. I miss her so much. She was the sweetest person in the world. I really regret not kissing her goodbye that day at the park. I need a hug right now. Sorry for bad English. I'm Spanish.
No apologies needed. Your English was wonderful. And yeah, folks, I've said it multiple times. I have just beamed about my grandma on this channel a few times. She was one of the most fiery, bright little Italian women I've ever known. She's incredible. And there were times in her last year where I had chances that I could have seen her more, spent more time with her, and I didn't because I was so busy with my own stuff and some depression and stuff. And now that she's gone, I regret every moment that I didn't spend with her. So if you have someone in your life that you really love, make the time you have with them count.
Story 5. My grandmother said, "Take care, my dear," in Low German. I visited her in the hospital. Her kidneys weren't working normally anymore. Our whole family was torn apart in silly arguments for years, and so we haven't seen each other for 7 years. My dad called me, and blood is thicker than water, and I thought it's time to act as an adult. I couldn't regret it if she'd die without seeing each other again. The nurse said that she looked so much better than the days before, and she recovered well. I said to Granny that I'll revisit her again next Saturday. I moved away 50 miles, and she kissed me on the forehead and my cheek and told me to take care. I drove home, and suddenly I realized that this was the last time I saw her. She just waited for everyone to say goodbye, and I cried my eyes out. Called my dad the next day, and he said, "No, don't worry, she looks so much better than 2 days before our visit." And I thought, he'll be right. 3 days later, I suddenly felt the same as I felt days before in the car, and 1 hour later, my landline rang, and I only answered the phone with, "I know." My dad was shocked. He wanted to call me because Granny died. My intention was right. Story 6. Not a nurse or doctor, but still creepy last words. I was 7 and in primary school. A kid I didn't know personally but was known to very rarely speak came up to me and said very quietly, "What's your favorite color?" Not knowing what else to say, I just replied, "Yellow. What about you?" "I like the color red. Want to see?" I said, "Sure, why not?" And the kid just ran off. Next day there was an ambulance outside school, and this kid had apparently snapped his back and some other bones. Apparently there was a lot of blood. I don't know if he knew or if he was just being the weird, quiet kid that everybody thought him to be. I think he died because it was a neighborhood rumor that he had, and I never saw him again. Story 7. Not a nurse, but this happened last year. My grandma was starting to show signs of declining. She was getting sick more, and she had a really nasty fall in November. We had to put her in a rehab center so she can rest because knowing her, she was gonna be too stubborn to follow doctor's orders to rest. The day before Thanksgiving, she talked about going home. It was true because we were going to check her out on Saturday and bring her home because that's what she wanted. But she kept insisting that she was going to go home that day, and we just thought, okay, Grandma. She held my hand and said that she loved me so much, and she held my husband's hand and said that he'd better take care of me, which he promised. Before I left, she blew me a kiss, and I would find out 3 hours later that she passed away. She did go home. She went back home to God to be with her husband and her sister again. Story 8. I used to work in an Army emergency room. Not a doctor, my actual job title was combat medic, but was working as an emergency technician. During the 5 years I worked there, was deployed to Korea for a year. Normally you don't get to stay in one place that long. I had 3 patients tell me they were going down or going out. Don't recall exact phrasing. Within less than a minute, they coded. After the first one, I learned to always listen when a patient said similar words and immediately called a code blue. There are many reasons for a person's heart to stop beating or for it to cease to beat in a functioning way, what's called fibrillation. Sometimes they can be helped depending on the cause, and sometimes not. But just being in a hospital and having someone take them seriously definitely increases their odds.
I'm forgetting the term now, but I swear there is a term that's come up for, people having this sudden sense and realization about their impending death. Something that medical equipment might not even reveal, or at least modern medical equipment. And yeah, that was something that when I was training to be a nurse's assistant, that the nurse trainer told us. She's like, if you go into hospice care or stuff like that, trust what people say. Sometimes, like if they say that they feel like something is wrong and they look worried about it, or they say they're going to die, she's like, maybe they're wrong, but let me tell you, they're right a lot more than you would think.
Story 9. I lost my grandfather September 2021 to lung cancer. Diagnosed in June, we found out in July, dead early September. He was in stage 4 lung cancer. Up and down all the time, chilly, then hot, then chilly again. I'll never forget the last time I saw him alive. He was sitting up with his oxygen tank cord leading into the kitchen to help him breathe, reading a newspaper. My mom explained I had to go and get ready for school. It started the next week. He smiled at me and told me good luck. He gave me a hug and a kiss and also told me, I love you, baby girl. He passed away almost 2 weeks later. My second week of classes, that same day he died, I saw his ghost around 1 a.m. standing in the corner of the room. It was freaky. I waved to him and he waved back before I broke down and left the room. It took months, but I saw him one last time in a dream. It was right after I found a voicemail with my Nana in it and him popping in to finish singing happy birthday to me. It was him and my papa, who had also died from lung cancer but years prior, putting a hand on my shoulder as they told me they were proud of me. I haven't forgotten that dream since. Story 10. My great-granddad was in his 90s and had lots of problems with blood and platelets in his final years. The finishing blow was when he was about to get into the car and a gust of wind blew the car door into him. He lost his balance, fell, and broke his hip and wrist. Combine that with his health problems, and he was in a bad way. 2 weeks went by, and the end drew near. For 2 days, he relived what the family thought were the best parts of his life. Some of it included working on the farm with his siblings, most of whom he outlived, and his parents. Then there were the times he worked with his son, my dad's uncle, and my dad. He passed once he was done reliving the past. Story 11. I'm a retired RN, and this story will stay with me for the rest of my life. It happened around 20 years ago, so details have left me, but here it is in a nutshell. We had a well-known lawyer admitted who was dying. He was also a crook, but that wasn't a public fact. The last week of his life, all he did was scream, "No, no, get away from me, don't touch me, leave me alone!" Or some version of that. Loud enough that patients at the other end of the hall, maybe 100 yards away, could hear him and were asking what was happening. I've always pondered whether perhaps he was seeing demons instead of the angels people speak of as they pass. It was really pitiful. Story 12. The body knows what it knows, and if a patient is really serious about the "I think I'm dying," take it very seriously if it's a mentally well person from what you can tell. Because oftentimes, minutes before people die unexpectedly, they can tell when their vital organs are shutting down. I've seen many patients die after letting the doctor know that they're dying, but the doctor doesn't take it seriously most of the time, which could be due to the situation. But even then, never take the word death lighthearted. Story 13. My dad worked in ICU and palliative care. He said that every single patient he had always saw and described other beings coming to collect them. Some people had a peace come over them and smiled with joy as they passed. Others described horrifying creatures of darkness coming for them. Those particular patients screamed and begged for help, begging not to be taken. I think a lot of us should consider if there's life after this one. Scary stuff.
While I personally don't believe in an afterlife, I don't see evidence of it, and I could certainly explain this stuff away, I still try and lead a good life, try and be a good person to others, and maybe just a clean conscience will help you have an easier passing. Maybe there is something beyond this life. I don't know, but it doesn't hurt to, be a good person, and when the time comes when you are passing, just have that peace of mind with you that, hey, at least I was good while I was here, and maybe I made a good difference.
Story 14. When my grandpa was on his deathbed, he couldn't talk and could barely open his eyes. My grandma was sitting by his side. You could tell my grandpa was trying to communicate. He gathered what strength he could and pointed to my grandma. We had a feeling that he was trying to tell her he loved her, so we voiced it for him. He dropped his hand, had a small smile, and passed away. Story 15. My friend's mom was in her last moments, and her son couldn't get to the hospital in time. They got him on the phone and put the phone to his mom's ear. Now, she had been unconscious for a while, according to the doctors, but as soon as she heard her son's voice through the phone, her eyes opened and she blurted out, "Did you eat yet?" Story 16. My grandfather died in April of this year. I wasn't particularly close to him, but he was a very good man. A few months prior, I was complaining to my parents about wanting a desk so I have a place to just do schoolwork, which he ended up giving me for Christmas, and I was absolutely thrilled. At his memorial, I walked up to him and prayed, promising to protect my family for him. I still use the desk every day, and it's in perfect condition. Miss you, Grandpa. Story 17. Definitely not as creepy as some others, but my dad's last words were, "I still feel weird." Sure enough, he lost oxygen, passed out, and got heart damage due to the lack of oxygen. He coded in the ambulance. They brought him back, but he had brain damage. He died a week later with my mom, his wife, and his parents in the room with him. He was never alone. Story 18. Not a doctor or nurse, but my mom's last words to my dad as she was in hospital were, "Why have the lights gone?" She was no longer getting enough oxygen to her brain and everything went dark before she died a few moments later. My dad's last words to me just 4 months later were, "I love you too." He was in the ICU at this point and his heart had given up. They worked on him for 6 hours, thinking they had him stabilized only for something else to happen, but he never regained consciousness. Story 19. I wasn't there when my brother died. I was too young to go into the room because he was just about to die and it would be too traumatizing. I didn't care. I wanted to see my brother. So I peeked in and wasn't able to see him as everyone was blocking my view, but I remember hearing his voice saying, "I don't want to die yet." He was a father, a husband of a pregnant wife, his second child, and probably one of the most looked up to in the family. He lost his life too soon.
I'm going to be honest, just reading that was kind of traumatizing, so I mean, maybe your parents or whoever was right by saying that was too traumatizing. I mean, you want to be there and stuff, but that's heartbreaking, and I hope that you're doing okay, and I hope that your brother's family is doing okay in his absence, because, boy, that is heartbreaking to hear.
Story 20. I remember my sister's story. She was a nurse in our local hospital 8 years ago. She was taking care of a patient, an 86-year-old lady who had a heart problem or something. It still creeps her out to this day when she hears the old lady's last words. "The lady in red always comes at night. I think she wants something from me." Not long after, the old lady dies of a heart attack at 7 p.m. My sister came home shaken after that shift. Story 21. Not creepy, but here it is anyway. On the day my dad was scheduled to have his life support cut off, he was intubated and couldn't talk. He was too weak to write anything down, but my mom broke the rules and took off her mask to kiss his cheek. He looked at me and wiggled his eyebrows. For 57 years, he'd been telling jokes and got one last laugh out of us before he went. Story 22. Not a doctor, but I was with my friend in the hospital for emotional support for his dying father. Literally, he sat up wide-eyed and looked at my friend and said, "They just told me what you did to them," and fell back dead. Years later, I found out that when he was in Afghanistan, he murdered innocent people and tortured them for kicks. I always knew there was something odd about him, but I never knew that. Story 23. My grandfather was about 93 when he passed away. He had fallen, badly hit his head, and shortly thereafter went unconscious. My father and his one brother came to my grandfather's deathbed waiting for the Catholic priest to come read my grandfather his last rites. The second the priest was done and almost had his hand on the door to leave the room, my grandfather was gone. My grandfather was a very devout Catholic, and my family swears he hung on just so he could get his last rites read to him before he passed on. Story 24. I worked in a long-term care setting, and some residents want to go on hospice, but the family wants them to stay alive, trapped in a body that's no longer working and causing significant pain because they aren't ready to say goodbye. I pray that families will learn to respect and accept the elders' wishes and get over themselves. Family members can be so selfish butts.
Yeah, I understand it is tough for family members, especially when they want to hang on to some hope that, there will be some miracle that'll come through. But boy, yeah, when someone is being just kept on life support and is in terrible pain, it's tough to convince some family members that it's just, the whole idea of they're not ready to say goodbye. When are you going to be ready with someone that you love? You've got to make yourself be ready for them, and they're in pain until you are ready. But once they're gone, you have your life to grieve and remember them and, keep their memory alive through your actions. Yeah.
Story 25. My grandfather was very particular about how he wanted to die. Quick. Just bang and that's it. On the 23rd of December 2015, he woke up as usual, shaved, made himself a coffee and breakfast, played with a dog a little, sat on the couch to watch morning news, and died. Just like that, as he always wished. I always loved when my grandparents joined us on Christmas Eve dinner. We always celebrated as a whole family together. Worst Christmas ever. Story 26. My uncle was at our home for his last days. He was in the bed and had times of clarity. At one of these times, he looked to the end of the bed, smiled really big. He reached out and said, "They are here for me." He was so happy. My mom asked if it was family. He said no, they were angels. They glowed, had wings, and were smiling at him. He reached out his hand, and it looked like he was holding the angel's hand. He looked at my mom and smiled, "Love you all," and said goodbye, and that was it. Story 27. Not a doctor, but a combat medic. The last words I heard from a civilian in our care was, "You'll see me again." Gone a few hours later, and sure enough, I saw him walking toward the tent and almost fainted from shock. It turned out he had a great humor and a twin.
If there is one hope that I have in this life, it is that I am able to tell one last joke or pull one last little cheeky prank like this before I go, because I can just appreciate that a lot,
Story 28. I'm always impressed by the stories about people who are dying and seemingly can let go on command. I always imagined that if I were dying, I'd not even have proper bladder control, let alone control over whether I would die or not.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.